Hi all, and welcome back to another YouTube video. Today we're going to go over how to check whether an implementation of interface has been called, and we're going to do that through a concept known as mocking. Now, mocking is something that is really simple to understand. It's just switching a class or an interface with something that mimics it. This is extremely useful for situations like when our code sends a HTTP request. Because ideally we'd want all of our tests to be localized so that we're not dependent upon external services, but we still want to test the code around it. So we can switch out our HTTP handler with a mimicked version, and we'll do that now. So we'll start by creating a new solution, and we'll have two projects in this. We'll start off with a unit test project, and I'm going to be using XUnit, and I'm going to call the project unit tests and the solution mocking tutorial, because that makes it easier, and we'll create that. And we're also going to be creating one more project within this, and this is going to be called implementation. And this can be a .NET Standard project or a .NET Core project or whatever project you're working with at the minute, as soon as it loads. There we go. And we'll just create a class library for this, .NET Core 5, and we'll call this implementation. The first thing we'll do, now we've got that set up, is in our implementation, we'll create our interface. And our interface is just going to be called iHTTP handler. And it's going to have one single method that a class will need to implement. It's going to return a HTTP response message. It's going to be called send, and it's going to accept two parameters. We'll call the first one content as a string, and the second one URL as a string. And now we've got that in place, we'll quickly build up our implementation of this. Our implementation of this is just going to be a HTTP handler. We'll make it implement an iHTTP handler. And for now, we can just have it throw an exception. I think that's fine. And now we need to set up one more class to call this, and we'll call this our requester class. Our requester class is going to have a constructor, which is going to accept a HTTP handler. We'll just call that handler. And we'll introduce a read-only field for it. And it's going to have one function, and the function's just going to return a string. And it's going to be called send dummy request. It can take no arguments for now, it doesn't really matter. And all this is going to do to get us started is call the handler, call send, and we'll just pass in empty strings for our content and our URL. And we'll also have it return an empty string for now. Okay, now that our setup is done, we're going to go to our unit tests. And we're going to create our first test that we'll call HTTP handler. We'll check the message is okay, and if it is okay, we'll return a string that says, hey, it's okay. So we'll name our test. We'll say, given calling HTTP handler, when response is okay, should return string with value of okay. And now we'll set this up, and we'll do the implementation of this test, and we'll create a new requester. And our requester is just a new type of requester. And I think we're going to have to add the reference to this here, so we'll reference in the project implementation. Now requester needs a constructor, and for now we'll just pass in our concrete implementation of HTTP handler. And then we'll do requester dot send dummy request. Now, if we were to run this, and in Rider the shortcut is Ctrl+TL to run your unit tests, you'll see that immediately what's happening is we're throwing a non-implemented exception. And it's actually coming from our HTTP handler, line 9. So if we go and check that, it's because we've told it to throw a non-implemented exception. Now, you'd think this is an easy fix, right? Well, rather than throw a non-implemented exception, we'll just return a new HTTP response message with a status code of, let's say, OK. Like that. And now if we were to rerun this test, then the test would succeed. This isn't ideal. And it's not ideal because what if we want to test that, what happens if it's a bad request, or if the URL wasn't found, or any other number of possibilities. So we'll put this back for now to throw the exception still, and we'll fix this using something called mocking. Now, we can mock in many ways. We could create another class that implements the iHTTP handler and test against that. But what we're going to do is use a library called mock. That's M-O-Q. So to do that, we'll go back to our unit test project and we'll go to manage NuGet packages and we will search for mock. And when it loads up, we'll see it's the top one. Currently it's 4.16.1 and we will install it. And now that it's all installed successfully, we can fix our test by mocking it. So let's create a new mock. So we'll var mock, and this is equal to a new mock with the uppercase M, and it takes a type of T. And in this case, our type of T that we want to mock is our iHTTP handler, because we want to mock our interface. And what we can do is swap out our requester constructor with our new mock and our mock.object. And now if we were to rerun this test, you'll see that it will pass. It's no longer throwing the exception because we are no longer calling our concrete implementation. So now that we've done this, let's add an assertion to our test. So we know that requester returns something, so we'll call this our result. And we want it to return OK, so we'll say assert dot equal, not dot empty, dot equal OK and result. Now if we were to run this, we will see that it fails because we're not actually returning anything. So let's go to our requester and let's set a variable for our handler, and we'll call this our response. And then we'll just have an if statement to say, well, if the response dot is success status code even, we will return OK. Now, if we run our test again, we should expect this to pass. But you've seen that it's failed. And it's a null reference exception in our requester class. So let's find out what the problem is. We'll put a breakpoint on line 14, which is where we're calling the handler, and we will debug our test. And when we step through this by debugging, we will see that we throw a null reference exception on line 15, and it's because our response is null. And that's because although we've mocked our handler, we haven't actually told it what to do when we're calling certain functions. So we'll fix that now by going back to our unit test project. And just below the line that says mock, on line 14, we'll say mock.setup. And we'll give it an alias, so t into t dot send. Now, send accepts two parameters, and for mocking to work, you need to tell it exactly what the request looks like when it goes in. So if you see our requester class, you'll see that we're passing it two empty strings. So if we call those two empty strings as our arguments, and then we need to tell it what we want it to return. So we'll need to add a dot returns, and we can say it wants a HTTP response message. So we'll say new HTTP response message, and that accepts an overload for the constructor of the status code. So we say HTTP status code dot OK. And now, if we were to run this again, we should hopefully get a success, and we do. So now let's test the other side of the argument, and let's test if it's a bad response, then we want it to return a not okay. So we'll just copy and paste this, and then we'll change the name. So we'll say when the response is not okay, or better, when the response is bad request, should return string with value of not okay. And we'll change the assertion to not okay, and we'll change the HTTP response message to bad request. Now when we run this, we should get one success message and one failure message. But that's because we haven't implemented it on the requester class. So let's implement this on the requester. And all we need to do is do an else, and then return not okay. And if we run that again, we have 2 successful tests. So that's the end of this video, and thank you again very much for watching. I really hope you find it useful. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.